Hey, you stupid Christian. Don't you go quoting the Ten Commandments to me. I mean, look at you. Polyester suit. Clear violation of Leviticus 19:19. And a tattoo. That violates Leviticus 19:28. Sheesh. What's this? Beef stroganoff. That's a violation of Exodus 23:19. Here. Have some Google cuisine. There's no railing around that roof. Someone sure isn't paying attention to Deuteronomy 22:8. So don't go quoting any Old Testament stuff to me, buddy. You just pick and choose what you want to follow in there yourself.
Excuse me.
Oh, great. It's holding.
Yeah, don't you think you're oversimplifying a bit there?
Nope.
Yeah, of course you don't. Sit down and shut up. Okay, so what is the role of the Old Testament law in the life of the New Testament believer? I'm no random proof texter myself, but what we find is that there is a role for it for the discerning. Initially, the fact that forms the bedrock of our discussion here is a recognition that both the Old and New Testament offer what are called covenants. You might say a sort of contract. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy, which contained the rules of the Jewish covenant, is in the format of an ancient treaty document. In the Old Testament, the way you signed on to the covenant was to show your loyalty to God by being circumcised. In the New Testament, the way you signed on to the covenant was to show your loyalty by professing allegiance to God through the covenant broker, Jesus Christ. And then you publicly demonstrated your loyalty with the entry rite of baptism. That's a simple way of putting it. Now, by itself, that explains why Christians aren't automatically obliged to obey every bit of the Old Testament law regardless of the content. The short of it being, that's a contract they didn't sign. Theoretically, you could sign it, and then as Paul says, you'd be obliged to obey the whole law. But Christians have signed a different contract with different stipulations. Now, all that said, the immediate objection a fundy atheist might make is that if this is all true, a Christian can't appeal to any part of the Old Testament law for moral guidance. But not so fast. Here's an analogy. Let's say we have a landlord who owns an apartment complex. To live in this apartment complex, you have to sign a lease with all sorts of rules. This will be our analogy to the Old Testament. Now let's say the landlord announces that he's opening a new apartment complex. If you're someone who wants to live in the new place, and you want to know what sort of rules you might have to live under, you can certainly wait for the new leases to be composed. But if you're a little impatient, you can take a look at the leases for the old apartment complex to get some idea what sort of rules the landlord might have on the new leases, or what sort of moral values he has. Because it's the same landlord, there will be certain values and morals that will undoubtedly appear on both leases, or else be part of the general moral landscape you'll find in both. Let's say, for example, the landlord is a guy who hates loud music and thinks it drives away potential new residents. There's little doubt that both leases will have as part of their code a rule against loud music. In fact, if a landlord hates loud music and you know this, it doesn't even have to be in the text of the new lease for you to realize that playing loud music in the new apartment complex would get the landlord upset. In this analogy, God is like the landlord, and the rule against loud music in enactment would be comparable to what would be called universal morals, which we'd expect to be common to both Old and New Testament covenants, things like not stealing or not committing idolatry. So that's why it might still be possible to appeal to some Old Testament laws as defining God's moral code, even while not obeying every one of them. We concluded part 1 of this series by noting the example of universal laws found in the Old Testament law. Now let's discuss the other categories using our landlord example. Let's say that the old leases our landlord offered have a rule that says all residents have to park their cars on the west side of the apartment complex on Tuesdays between 7 and 9 p.m., and not park in spaces on the east side. Would we expect this to be on leases for the new apartments? That depends. To find out, we have to know why this rule was made in the first place. Let's just say the rule was made because on Tuesdays between 7 and 9 p.m., the city sends its garbage trucks in to collect trash from the bins which are on the east side of the building. And this means that if residents park their cars in that area, they might get damaged. Now, the new leases may or may not have the same rule. If there's a place in that parking lot where the garbage is picked up at the same time, the rule could be slightly different if garbage is picked up on Thursdays between 2 and 4 p.m. Or there might not be a rule like it at all if garbage is picked up somewhere other than the parking lot. This would be like what in the Old Testament law would be called cultural universals. Laws geared to Israel's culture that have a universal moral law or principle behind them. My favorite example of this is from Deuteronomy 22. I knew a fundy atheist who said that you would be hard-pressed to find home builders who follow this rule, but actually they do follow the modern equivalent. In ancient Israel, the flat roof of a house would be used for many purposes, such as sleeping, household chores, and entertaining. Even today the roof is used for such things in modern Middle Eastern nations. We don't use our roof the same way, but the modern equivalent is a balcony. And our builders certainly do make sure that they follow the point of this rule to the letter, because what's at stake is a much larger moral concern, that of people's safety. In the same way, in the example of our apartment leases, the overriding principle to the older law was to prevent property damage. But if the new apartment complex doesn't have the same rule because of different conditions like garbage being picked up in a different place or time, that doesn't mean the landlord changed his mind about preventing property damage. The principle is still one he values, and that means even if the new lease doesn't say don't damage property, chances are that that's a principle the landlord will still observe. And by the way, this reflects a mistake a lot of fundy atheists make when they address this issue. They think that this reflects some notion of biblical morality as circumstantial or subjective. When they argue that, though, they're failing to recognize that there's a difference between what we might call first-order moral concerns, the moral universals, and second-order moral concerns, or laws that are applications of those universals to specific situations. The first-order morals remain the same and are considered objective. It's the second level that changes and can be subjective or circumstantial. Finally, we should briefly mention a third category of what could be called ritual laws. There's no direct analogy to this in our apartment example. But in the Old Testament covenant, this would have been things like festivals, circumcision, and sacrifices. Or in the New Testament covenant, it would be baptism and communion. Obviously, these would be quite specific to their covenants. In all of this, the critical question with respect to the Old Testament is, how do we know which laws reflect first-order morals and which reflect second-order morals? Well, the answer is, you have to do research and figure it out. Yeah, I know. Fundy atheists hate it when we ask them to think. But that's the way it is. Bottom line, though, is there's not automatically an inconsistency in using one particular Old Testament moral law while ignoring others. That would have to be argued on merit. In the first two parts of this series, we discussed different categories of law in the Old Testament, and why this means it can be perfectly legitimate to continue to observe some while ignoring others. With that groundwork set, let's invite a couple of objections from the fundy atheist. Yes?
Jesus said that he came to fulfill the law, not destroy it. So that means you still ought to be obeying it.
We're not saying the law was destroyed. That's right. In fact, anyone who wants to sign on to that old covenant right now can do so. Except there'd be some problems. First of all, without a temple to perform sacrifices in, you're going to have a hard time fulfilling all your obligations. But beyond that, here in Deuteronomy 18, it says that the adherent to this covenant is to be on the lookout for a prophet like Moses. Well, Moses' job was to broker the old covenant. That was his chief distinctive. So this means that they need to look for a new prophet who is also broker of a covenant. Christians argue that that would be Jesus. So in effect, one of the rules of the old covenant is that you have to sign up for the new covenant when it's available to you. Anyway, bottom line is, no one says the law has been destroyed just because there's a new covenant. And when Jesus says he came to fulfill the law, the meaning of the word he uses is that he intends to obey it, something he had to insist upon because of charges like those made by his opponents that he was trying to break the law. Okay, what's next? Yes?
There's a lot of places where it says the law is forever, so that means you still ought to be obeying it.
Okay, look. Since the law hasn't been destroyed and you can still join the old covenant, the law isn't gone, so that's not an issue. Even so, the word used in the Hebrew translated forever is this one. And according to the leading study on this subject, which is this book, this word doesn't exactly mean forever. It means something more like in perpetuity. In other places it's used to describe the term of an indentured servant. So unless you think that this means the servant's boss would dig the servant out of his grave and put him to work, this clearly does not mean forever in the sense that covenant would always be kept, but implies that the Jews would keep these feasts and such as long as they maintained the covenant agreement and didn't break it. At the same time, it hardly indicates that God cannot sign a new covenant or contract with others on different terms. So let's sum it up. Old Testament law has laws that belong in different categories. Some reflect universal morals, others reflect conditions specific to ancient Israel and concepts in that time, and a large group of those would be purity regulations. Finally, some laws are ritual in nature. Discussion can continue over what laws in the Old Testament belong in what category, but it is clear that the law retains a certain application today, even if not in the same way for us, and even if the fundy atheists don't have the mental tools to grasp it. Yeah, you heard me. Before I go, one more thing I want to add that should blow their minds a bit. The Old Testament law was structured like a typical ancient law code of that day. An important thing to note about such codes is reported by a scholar named Delbert Hillers in his book Covenant, the History of a Biblical Idea. In other words, the law codes were not simply blindly followed without any sort of trial or examination for applicability, or without any concern for possible mitigating circumstances. How is that important? Well, just keep that in mind for possible future vids. See ya.